started recording it now, yes.
Okay. Any declarations of interest amongst the panel members? No, great. Okay, our first item today is the urban design review study located in Pier 8, Block 16. The lead planner in the file is Jennifer Roth. Good afternoon, Jennifer, which I cannot see.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome.
We're ready for your presentation. Please keep the presentation under 10 minutes, and we'll give you a nod if you run over a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone still hear me okay?
Yes, yep.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, Jennifer Roth. I'm a planner with the City of Hamilton's community section. And I'll begin the presentation today by providing a brief introduction of our study, and then I'll hand it actually over to Captain Brooke and his team at Brooke McElroy, who the city has retained to assist with this study. Also participating on the call and available to answer questions at the appropriate time is Alyssa Mahood, the Senior Project Manager of Community Planning. Calvin has several individuals from his team as well, Victor, Chung, and Wei online as well. So to provide, I want to go back to May of 2017 when City of Hamilton's council approved a zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivision for the lands located at Pier 8 for the intended purpose of implementing the setting sail designations. Shortly after, the zoning bylaw amendment was appealed to the local planning appeal tribunal, and then moving forward, September of 2019 through July of 2019, mediation occurred and the parties reached an agreement to resolve the appellant's concerns, and minutes of settlements were finalized on September 16th of 2019. So the parties agreed to the following, which implement through this study. So what we're required to do is that the city has to bring forward for planning council's consideration an amendment to the setting sail secondary plan and an implementing zoning bylaw amendment that would redesignate and rezone the existing institutional block, which is on the slide outlined in red, to permit either residential or mixed uses in either a mid-rise or high-rise form. The terms of the settlement required that the city complete this study and bring forward the OPA and ZBA, but within 1 year of the date of completion, execution of the settlement minutes. However, because of COVID-19, we've been a bit delayed, so we've requested an extension on that time frame. So the two key elements that I want to go through from the minutes of settlement. One of the important ones is that the total number of units, being 1,645 across the entirety of Pier 8, will not be changing. So that's the maximum number of units. As well, within the existing zoning, 15% of all units across the site will be family units, which are defined as 2 or more bedrooms. This was always intended to achieve a more balanced demographic mix. So of the 1,645 units, 195 of them had to be family units. You'll see on the slide that there's a bit of a sliding scale in that third bullet point. So this is what we're bringing forward today, what we're studying. So for Block 16, as the height of a building, theoretical building, increases, additional family would be required to be provided by the developer. So if a building between 20 and 30 stories is approved in the future, 100 additional family units on top of the 195 would be required to be 2 or more bedrooms. But the total number of units, I want to stress this, does not change. So it's still 145. So in order to fulfill and implement the minutes of settlement, the scope of work has been broken down by the city into 2 phases. The first phase is the phase we are in now, and what we're calling the Pier 8 Block 16 Opportunity Study. And it involves a review of the existing Pier 7 and 8 urban design study that was completed in 2016 by Brooke McElroy to provide some guidance during the implementation stage of these minutes. looking at the opportunity for different heights on this block and the associated urban design parameters that would be required to accommodate a mid-rise building. The second phase is the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment for the land based on the design direction established in the first phase. So to go into a little more detail, the scope of work for the phase we are in now includes testing and establishing appropriate building heights for Block 16, evaluating Block 16 as an opportunity site for a change in land use, and developing associated urban design guidelines to be added as an addendum to the approved Pier 7 and 8 urban design study. This addendum will be presented to council for approval and adoption. The second phase will commence once the urban design study is approved by council, and it will involve the preparation of the implementing official plan and zoning bylaw amendments based on the policy framework and design guidelines that we are currently working on. Consistent with the previous Pier 7 and 8 development applications, the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment for Block 16 will be formally submitted by the Waterfront Office to the Planning Division for review. The development applications will be prepared and will proceed through the Planning Act application process, which will include a statutory public meeting and will likely be coming back to this panel. Hand it over to Calvin Brooke now to provide an overview of the work that's been completed to date on the opportunity study.
Okay. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I just have to change something here. Okay, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, yep, now you're good.
Okay. Okay, so Victor, who is part of our team, is actually controlling the slides, and he's going to advance the slides for me. I believe Victor is actually in Vancouver. Is that right, Victor? Yeah, I think he's on mute. Okay, so as Jennifer mentioned, we did the original 2016 urban design study for Pier 7 and 8, and it's fantastic to see the progress the city has made in selecting a development team and having a preliminary design. And we're super excited to be part of this process to review Block 16. This slide just highlights a couple of key things that came from that original study. And one of them has to do with that a mix of building heights to create a variety in urban form is actually a strength. So looking at Block 16 as a way to, I would say, break a fairly consistent mid-rise pattern of 8 stories, we actually see as a positive thing. The other thing noted in the 2016 study was the importance of having public parking so that citizens from Hamilton and visitors actually have a chance to come to the site on a year-round basis, particularly given the investment the city is making in the public realm. We're anticipating quite a bit of demand for some parking spaces, which are presently really haven't been accounted for in the design to date. So there's some aspects of this study that overlap with that opportunity to look at ways of providing more public parking. Next slide, please. The first scenario we looked at was a mid-rise scenario. There are 3 scenarios altogether. And just to kind of position the site, it actually has some exceptional qualities being on that kind of far northwest corner of the site, where it has an axial alignment with James Street, but also has a kind of visual prominence on the harbor that you would be able to see as you're entering Hamilton from the bridge locations. Next. Block 16 is also flanked by 3 really high quality public realm pieces, which is the waterfront promenade, the greenway on the south side, as well as the open space, future kind of community uses on the west. Next, please. One of the opportunities that we identified in the 2016 study was the potential to have a mid-block connection linking the greenway to the waterfront promenade. This wasn't actually picked up in the current developer proposal, but we think it has even more relevance today as a way of, as a device for transition, particularly if we're thinking about transitioning from a kind of mid-rise format on the east to a taller building on block 16. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that could happen. Next. So in the rise scenario, we've been looking at the potential for a 12-story building, but kind of having this pedestrian muse linking the greenway to the waterfront park. And in this case, we're recommending a 12-meter setback on block 16 that would be flanked by lower rise components of the building, so in the 3 to 4 story range. And thinking that those lower rise elements could be townhomes or live-work units that would have at-grade access, so front doors flanking either side of the muse, which we think would create a kind of very positive public focus to the role of that muse. It should be noted that we're not proposing the muse is in public ownership. It remains as a private parcel, but with an easement for a public walkway through it. Next, please. So in 3D, you can see the 12 stories on block 16 with that pedestrian muse acting as a transitional device between block 1 and block 16. Next. In all of these cases, we've tested these scenarios in terms of shadow impacts. This is taken on March 21st. And you can see that in this 12-story scenario, the impacts are marginal and we think quite acceptable. Next. And then just take a look at how that mid-rise format would be seen from different vantage points. In this case, from James Street. And you can see that it's pretty consistent with the sense of scale that already exists, taken from these vantage points. So the mid-rise scenario is very much, I think, in keeping with a vision of consistency where block 16 is just part of this lower kind of mid-rise fabric. And next slide. And here you can see it in context. So this scenario yields something in the range of getting close to 150,000 square feet. So we might be looking at up to 130, 140 residential units within this building. And the parking requirement for that, we think, could probably fit comfortably within the footprint of Block 16 itself. Please. The next scenario we tested was 30 stories, and you know, choosing 30 stories was a slightly arbitrary decision, and I think it kind of came from the 30 stories, which is the height cap for the downtown district. However, this is the downtown district, but we just kind of use this as a starting point to test what it would look like on Block 16. Next. Oh, are you guys seeing that kind of sideways? Okay, on my screen, it's kind of been flipped on the drawing. Actually, Victor, maybe if we go to the next one. Okay, so this is better. This is showing that same concept of the muse, but in this case, a 15-meter wide building face to building face with a public walkway, kind of tree-lined walkway through the middle, flanked on either side by at-grade accessible townhome units. That goes up to 3 stories, and then the building sets back or steps back to create a 25-meter separation distance between the taller elements on Block 1 on the right and the 30-story building on Block 16 on the left. And when we talk about a 25-meter separation distance, the guidelines will have that applied to the face of balconies or terraces where they exist. So it is a true 25-meter separation. Next. And again, looking at the March 21st shadow study, the floor plate we've tested here is 750 square meters. So a fairly small shadow impact that moves rapidly across the site. And in fact, in the afternoon, the impact is largely into the water, not on the land itself. So again, we think this is quite acceptable from a shadowing perspective. Next. So once again, we took a look at the various, what is this building kind of, what is the presence of this building as we see it from different vantage points in Hamilton, and here looking from different points on James Street. Next slide. Going back further up James Street, you can start to see, although the building is visible, it kind of blends into the scale of the kind of downtown massing. So this kind of got us to thinking, what is the role or opportunity associated with a taller building? And can it be a kind of beacon or landmark that signifies this kind of new revitalization of the harbor as a thriving neighborhood, which, of course, Pier 8 is all about that. changing the whole perception of Hamilton's interface with the waterfront. Next. So I think what we felt looking at this 30-story version is, although it is a visible kind of landmark, its proportions, you know, are a little bit squat. Kind of, it doesn't have that opportunity of a taller, thin kind of beacon-like element, which I think suggested to us that it may be harder to kind of latch onto that opportunity of creating a real landmark with a building of this height. Next. And then, you know, further back, you start to see, especially the view from Sam Lawrence on the lower right-hand corner, that the 30-story tower really just kind of melds into the overall fabric of the skyline and does not really create this opportunity of declaring the site as this kind of exceptional destination. Next. And well, you can't see anything here, but Jason Thorne asked us to take a look at what one experience getting off the platform at the West Harbor GO station would you be able to see a building on at Pier 8? And with the 30-story version, the answer is no, you actually can't see it. Next, please. So the third scenario we've looked at is a 45-story building. And there's a couple of reasons we picked this height. Next slide. So one of the reasons was we're kind of trying to think about achieving a height and a proportion that seemed to respond more to this beacon-like opportunity and creating more visibility as seen from the downtown and from the harbor, but perhaps not setting a precedent for building height that was out of context. So what we did is we looked at the tallest existing building in Hamilton, which is Landmark Place, which is a 43-story building. But we looked at the geodetic height, which is at 226 meters, and extended that height as a datum, which when you take a look at the opportunity on block 16 could result in a 45-story building. Actually, this is 2 meters shorter than the 226. So basically it's achieving a height that we think works really well from a proportion and beacon opportunity, but is not a set of precedent that goes beyond what is the present height cap in Hamilton. Next, please. And then this is just another view of that kind of data as seen from the sequence from downtown to Pier. To Pier.
Calvin, are you getting close now, Calvin? Are you getting close to your presentation?
I probably have 5 more minutes.
All right.
So this is a view from the bridges, so you can see very clearly setting this kind of landmark. Next, please. Next one, yeah. And from the Skyway Bridge. Okay, sorry. I think we jumped to the wrong slide here. Next slide. Next. Okay, so we just looked at different formats to try and achieve this kind of thinner profile. And this is showing in the 45-story example, transition from an 850 square meter floor plate thinning out to 650 square meters. Next. A kind of triangulated version. Next. And then the one that we think works quite well, which is more of this ovoid form, which also has the added benefit of being able to mitigate wind packs better as a kind of curved form. Next. So again, the shadow impacts really aren't that different from the 30-story version because the shadows are falling into the water. Next. And then, of course, taking those same views, you certainly get this idea of a building that is very prominent, very exceptional, and perhaps has this opportunity to declare itself as a kind of beacon for the harbor. Next. And next. And again. And so even from the distance, you can see the prominence of the Block 16 site with this kind of height. Next. And in this case, yes, it is visible from the platform of the GO station. Next, please. So here we're achieving a much bigger building, maybe with as much as 350 units, which is interesting because the overall unit count isn't changing on the site. What this suggests is it frees up the rest of the site to have less units, perhaps more of a variety in building height, but also reduces the need for unit-related parking on the balance of the site, which in turn could be a way of providing distributed public parking on those other sites. This scenario also has the advantage of having an additional 150 family units for the overall development. Next. So I'll just really quickly go through this. You know, one of the challenges in thinking about the guidelines, especially for the 45-story building, is we know that this building has to be represent design excellence. It has to be exceptionally well done. So how do we think about positioning the guidelines to make that happen? Next. We'll be looking at guidelines for both the mid-rise version and also for the tall building versions. Next. And for the tall building, the objectives are to create a visual anchor that's emblematic of the harbor. Something that really captures the public imagination and perhaps represents innovation in multi-unit tall building living. So thinking about quality of life features that are actually visible and make this building unique. Next. One of the thoughts is there a way to actually express the greenway going up vertically as kind of the terminus, the western terminus of the greenway? Are there green elements or elements that suggest kind of a sustainable infrastructure that can be seen from James Street? Next. So these are just some precedents that kind of respond to that idea of this greenway. But also thinking about balconies that actually kind of can be transformed into living spaces depending on the seasons. Next. The idea of having a very prominent cap and how we use architectural lighting to declare this site on the harbor. Next. We think the ground level opportunities for a really high quality public realm and landscape exist with the Muse, and we will be creating guidelines to promote that. Next. And being able to express perhaps the common elements, the shared uses of the building, green elements that pick up on the greenway, and how the building kind of invites or captures the imagination through things like interesting fenestration and lighting. Next. And how we use public art in integrated fashion, kind of declaring the western edge of this new neighborhood. And sorry to have gone on longer, but that's our final slide. Thank you.
Very much for your presentation. It's very good. We'd like to at this time take an opportunity for each panel member to seek any clarification on any points which may require any further explanation. Please hold comments for the panel discussion portion. Just questions only at this point, please. So we'd like to start with Yasin. Is Yasin with us today?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Maybe you could open up. Thanks.
Yeah. Calvin, thank you very much for the presentation. It's quite a provocative proposition. I remember the feasibility presentation of the master plan, and it was quite an incredible vision for the waterfront. So this is equally provocative and challenging. I was just wondering if could you please contextualize the status of Block 16 within that master plan? What is I'm trying to understand how that master plan is evolving other than being just in study form suddenly, because obviously this fluctuation in heights is going to cause a lot of other ripple effects on that original vision. And so could you just expand on that? And then secondly, could you go into a little bit more detail in terms of the numbers of units? Because if we have a cap of 1645 across the whole site, putting a 45-story tower, putting in a 12-story tower, you said it was around 130 units, 45 would probably put it to around 450, or is it less? And how does that affect parking? In your mind, and then of course the ripple effects on the master plan. So it's really, I'm trying to understand what the status is with this proposition.
So,
Victoria, can I interject quickly? It's Jennifer speaking.
Sure.
To provide feedback on, like, nothing's changing with the subdivision and the total number of units is staying the same. Within the zoning that exists on all the other blocks, there was a minimum and a maximum number of units that needed to be provided. So the developer still has to provide those on the remaining. So still have a certain range that is required. So there'll be a bit of a ripple effect if they're redistributed.
So sorry, that's not very clear. When you say there's a range, obviously putting a 45-story tower will consume a lot more units in terms of your overall count, which could potentially reduce the units elsewhere on these other blocks and create more open space. So that's what I'm trying to understand, how, again, going back to the master plan, how that affects, because otherwise you're saying that each block is still has a maximum number of units that they're obligated to provide. Okay. I thought the idea was to free up land by putting more area into a tower.
So there would also be larger units that are required as well as a result of this. So unit increase in size, they will, with number of bedrooms, they would increase the amount of space required across the site. But I'm just trying to find the existing zone. I know James is very familiar with this, but there are ranges that are required.
Yeah, I think I'm putting the question to Calvin more from an urban design standpoint in terms of the kind of the disposition of the volume of the mass and just the kind of character of development that we're trying to go towards in relation to what it was previously, because suddenly to focus on one parcel now, I know we're going into the next stage, but is the understanding that the rest of the master plan is still that way, or are you studying potential changes to that master plan?
So maybe if I can quickly respond. It's safe to say our scope is very much confined to, for this exercise to get council approval is very much focused on block 16. But we are identifying the fact that, perhaps we're looking at something like 350 units in a 45-story building, which means the rest of the site only has to supply 1,300 units down from the 1,645. So I view that as a very positive thing because it frees up those other blocks to, first of all, provide, I would see the bulk of the family-related units being in the other blocks where you can kind of walk up from the ground or second floor. It provides an opportunity for more variety in height in the architectural character, whereas there was a kind of fairly consistent 8-story datum across the whole site. And as I said, it also means on the ground plane, as you suggested, it might free up more space for building related courtyards or even public spaces. And for the parking level, it means that more of that below grade parking, which I think it's fair to say will be limited to 1 story down because of the cost of the water table, that more of that space could be public parking. So I think if this is adopted, it will mean the development team and their architects are going to go back and revisit all of those other blocks. I don't think it changes the zoning as much, but it changes how they will achieve the balance of those 1,300 units.
Okay, and again, just a question about parking on if you are potentially taking on 350 to 375 units on a 45-story tower, are you creating some kind of a podium condition to absorb that parking? Because this will be the first, assuming this will be the first development, right? That sets the tone for the...
Yeah, good question. And I forgot to mention that. So in that 40, 30 and 40 scenario, there are changes required to block 1 as well in order to achieve that setback that we talked about. So what we are hoping will happen is that block 1 and block 16 below grade will be a combined parking garage. If you can combine them, it does 2 things. On 2 levels, you can achieve the parking required for both block 1 and block 16. You can also have the parking access further to the east, so it's not quite as prominent, you know, on that kind of northwestern tip. So I think with the taller building option, it almost requires that block 1 and block 16 be combined below grade.
Right.
I just want to point out, it's Jennifer, that there's no that will be required on block 1 to accommodate a shared parking facility.
Below grade, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're not considering podium parking.
Okay. So just one last question, and I'll pass it on. So theoretically, Calvin, if we take like 350, 400 units in a tower, subtract that from 1645, you could accommodate the total development in, let's say, three and a half towers in terms of mass, which would free up a lot of land, right? Is there a proposition like that coming up?
No, I don't think we would support that.
Okay. 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 I'll pass it on to others. Yeah.
Okay, Jackie, can you jump in?
Yeah, my question about the parking has been answered, and I have no other questions.
Okay, Mario?
My only question is about the, I'm not sure if was in the original study, master plan, was a high-rise or landmark building ever contemplated or studied?
No. During the of our work, we were proposing a range of heights that I'd say, to be fair, was still in the mid-rise format, but it was definitely taller than the 8 stories that ended up being in the zoning. But no, we never looked at a landmark tall building in that original study. I just to contextualize that, there was a very strong kind of principle of trying to make Pier 8 an extension of the North End neighborhood. Mind you, I mean, all of those mid-rise buildings are different than the North End, but there was a desire to kind of have that more human scale. So this is this is definitely taking a new approach based on the idea of creating something exceptional to the norm. What that opportunity represents in terms of creating an identity for the harbor.
I also want to state that the urban design study was implementing the secondary plan, providing guidance on the height established through the secondary plan process.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, that's it for me then.
Okay, let's move to Tim.
I have no questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think my only question is, I could see parking being an issue if you can only go down one level and fitting in on that existing site enough parking to satisfy this. So I guess from that, there generates a bit of a concern that the remaining parcels should be looked at, because you could end up building a series of parking structures to compensate for the density that you've driven into. Basically, the properties have more value, and the properties that have more value are the blocks fronting the water. So, as you know, the pressure in the industry would be to develop the waterfront properties with as much density as possible. And what spins off from that is, what is your parking strategy? So I guess I'm making a comment rather than a question, but I guess maybe Calvin, you can speak to the notion of what you envision the parking solution being from an overall perspective, like in a little more detail, or maybe the city should be expanding your study to take a look at what the ramifications on the other properties are going to be relative to what you're doing here. I guess that's a comment, not a question, isn't it? Anyway, I don't know what you think, Kelvin.
I guess first of all, what I'd say is I think the opportunity. So as I said, the existing developer proposal does not provide public parking, and I think that's an issue. I think everybody recognizes that's an issue, and there hasn't been a solution proposed yet. In a kind of totally coincidental way, this 45-story scenario, I think, actually makes the ability to address that easier than it would have been before, because it's freeing up all of those other blocks to have much less pressure for parking supply related to the units on each of those blocks, because the numbers have dropped. I also think on-street parking is a great idea down there, although that I don't think is part of the present proposal. And it's also key, in my opinion, to making the retail viable. I guess what I would say is I think we can definitely identify these opportunities, just like I'm doing here, when we present this to committee and to council, and suggest that obviously the developer is going to have to come back with a revised proposal, and that within that revised proposal, I would propose that a parking strategy be included that addresses the need for public parking and where it should best be located.
When you use the term public parking, are you referring to resident parking or general public parking?
General public parking. So people who want to come to the promenade, people who want to use the retail, people who just in the dead of winter want to go for a walk and they don't necessarily live in walking distance. I think this is going to be a huge destination for people in Hamilton, not to mention people from outside of the city. And the last thing we want is that, illegal parking is happening in the north end because there's so many people wanting to get to Pier 8. And the residents of the north end are very concerned with that as well. So I think generally everybody's on board with the notion of providing public parking. So it's just one of those things that hasn't quite been addressed, and I think needs to in the next phase.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Hi, it's Alyssa Mahood here. Can I just answer a little bit more to the parking, the required parking question? So right now in the zoning bylaw for Pier 8, for the lands that would approve part of that subdivision, parking that's required can be permitted anywhere on Pier 8 as long as it's within 300 meters. So when a development proposal comes in for Block 16, we would amend the zoning to include that so that you can ensure there could be shared parking across the entire site of Pier 8. And as well, the city is working on a public parking strategy for the waterfront lands as well that could see parking in other locations, not necessarily on Pier 8, but a shared facility elsewhere. Thanks.
Okay. So based on the information provided by the city staff and the applicant, each panel member will now provide feedback and recommendations. So we'll start with Yasin again, please.
Thanks, Vince. So I'm personally still struggling to visualize, how this affects the master plan, because I keep seeing a lot of variations in what could be done. So I accept the idea that a single point tower with exceptional architectural quality is is great. I think, sorry, that was my son in the background. I just think that it's, I don't see the need for that kind of a high-rise development right at the corner of the waterfront, right there. It creates a trying to understand even the view corridors that you end up getting, because essentially the view is to the tower constantly. Even I think you have view conditions that you've presented which are away from the site, but even I guess within the site, that the tower will start to dominate the configuration of the view corridors. So that's just a general comment. I am concerned about the whole parking strategy, and I feel like I'm imagining that there's a couple of blocks of below grade where there's continuous parking to even make this manageable if it's going to be a single story condition where on street you actually have free pedestrian movement and gracious sidewalks and tree-lined streets that you were presenting. To be able to achieve those kind of things, that somehow that parking has to disappear somewhere. And I'm not convinced that you're able to hide it away below grade. So I visualize sort of parking blocks coming up. And if these densities are being transferred into a tower, then yes, the land gets freed up for those kind of buildings. But I'm not sure if that's what your original master plan envisioned. I think we had discussed even burying parking previously somehow as part of landscaping and creating sort of a landscape structure around parking. But I don't think that was clear at that point as well. Generally, I would say I have a concern with the 45-story tower. So if there's a drive for more height, I can, I don't see the whole point of having a high-rise tower with that kind of high visual impact needed here. It's more the whole focus, I think, for the development from the beginning was about creating good streets and good urban fabric, and I think that was the strength of the master plan, that it created this balance between interior and exterior space, where it was kind of a community. All the precedents you had, as I recall, were, they were from Holland and Scandinavia. There was this kind of evenness of architectural quality across the whole master plan, rather than having to focus it on a point tower. I think that if you go the route of point tower, then I see major changes coming up to the configuration of the way the blocks are laid out, and just the I guess the parking strategy. It's again, I'm struggling just to visualize what happens to the master plan, that the balanced master plan you had. So I would recommend a lower height. Ideally, I'd like to stay with the mid-rise condition, because I think that already has a precedent, and that you've created a kind of visualized a whole sort of set of strategies around that kind of a master plan with those heights in mind. Going to point tower conditions are going to throw things off considerably, but it does mean that it has to be supported by a full full planning of the master plan again. So that is not evident here, and that's my concern right now, that I don't understand how all of this transfers across the rest of the site in terms of heights and massing.
Thank you, Yasin. Okay, Jackie.
Yeah, I same concerns about the parking ending up everywhere under the site. And just to add that to grow trees that go beyond the 25 years of waterproofing on top of these garages, it's important to pull that garage away from the tree lined areas or the parks in order to allow them to grow to their full potential. That's it.
Okay, Mario.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have I share some of Yasin's concerns, and I feel a little bit like it's to look at this in isolation without relook or rethinking the whole master plan in terms of where that density gets distributed. I think is a bit of a concern because you don't know. I know that you only have control over this one piece, and that's what you've been asked to study, but I feel like it's sort of looking at it in isolation, but it's going to have dramatic effect over the whole vision for this place. The second thing, while I understand the reasoning for going to the 45-story and make it more slender and more attractive and more of a landmark, I'm a little bit concerned about the precedent it would set that if you the city's own tall building guidelines have set 30 stories as the maximum, or the escarpment as the datum. Unless I misunderstood that. I think we're matching the landmark building as opposed to the escarpment. So I think that's another concern, is just the precedent that gets set, and how we sort of control what happens after that. I think that the positive thing would be to, if the density goes into the tower and allows for more open green space throughout the overall Pier 8 development, that would be great, but I'm not sure how that gets enforced. That's for me, Vince.
Thanks, Mario. Okay, Tim.
Thanks, Vince. I'm going to have a little bit more to say, I think. I do share the concerns of Mario and Yasin, and I think they're really both saying the same thing, which is this, to make this dramatic kind of change to the vision and plan for Pier 8, proper urban design study needs to be done. A proper update and a full update to the urban design plan is needed, and likely to the secondary plan currently, for all the reasons they've mentioned. This, making this kind of change to that vision is, it's moving from comprehensive holistic planning to incremental planning, and we really can't fool ourselves. We're in the Ontario planning context, and that's just going to set the stage for more incremental planning and more visual beacons, and we can't pretend that this is a one-off situation, notwithstanding the context is an LPAT decision and a settlement. It just hasn't happened anywhere in Ontario, and I don't see it happening here. So we really have to think very carefully about the enormous risk the city would be taking in introducing a landmark building like this for the reasons it's set out. Things that need to be thought of, even if you aren't going to do a full-blown update to the urban design study, and I understand the clock is ticking, hopefully you have more time and can do a more thorough review, but there's a whole bunch of questions that arise here. First of all, fundamentally and this goes back to, I think, Yasin's and Mario's and Jackie's concerns, is what's the impact of this building on Pier 8 itself, on the place and the destination you're trying to create there. So we've seen these view studies. We can understand maybe there's going to be some benefit by creating this visual beacon to the image of the city, to these distant views of the city. But at the end of the day, that's secondary to what the objective is here, which is to create a great place, a great destination. So what's the experience for people that are going to be on Pier 8? How is that tower going to relate to the adjacent public realm? You've given us some ideas about the transition in this mid-block muse, but that's, compared to the other open spaces all around this site, that's not terribly important, quite frankly. So that has to be addressed, how this building is going to address that public realm and improve it. The distant view thing, in my view, Hamilton does not need a visual beacon to be a great city. You can see why that might be a compelling idea, but there's a whole bunch of great ways to create landmark buildings, and this isn't the only way. So, I mean, that's a very key question: is do you need truly this visual beacon, and how is it going to contribute to a great place? Is it is it something that should be terminating the view from James Street? Terminating the view of James Street with the condo tower is saying there's a tower down here, but the lure of Pier 8 is not the buildings, it's the water, and it's the open space, and it's there, but it's the water and what's happening in and around the water. So really, in my view, you want that view open, even if you can't see the water. I'm not sure if you can see the escarpment in Burlington, but you want that view open. So I don't believe this is an appropriate way to terminate that particular view. How is this relating to downtown and the objectives there about creating a landmark kind of skyline? This is really setting up Pier 8 to compete with that. Maybe that's okay. And if you're going to do that, then I don't think 45 stories is necessarily your benchmark. You want to do something perhaps even taller. So, and by the way, I meant to disclose up front, I wrote the second setting sail secondary plan 15 years ago, and long before it was approved, I knew that we were going to come back and be looking at the opportunities for tall buildings on this side. I had no idea it would happen in this way. But in my view, tall buildings probably are appropriate on Pier 8. 20, 25 stories was sort of my notion, but who knows, maybe a single landmark building. But again, it needs that study. The other very important consideration is this notion of doing this to get these additional family size housing units. The key question is, how are you going to ensure those are actually affordable family housing units? They will be very expensive units on the waterfront unless they are secured as through some sort of affordable housing incentive or agreement. We have to be very careful here that you might get the larger units, but in fact, you won't see families in them because they just be affordable for families with children. That's an issue everywhere in Ontario, certainly in Toronto, and it's going to be one in Toronto, in Hamilton. So, you have to, I think, look at a strategy that's separate from this kind of bonusing approach, if you will, to secure those family size units. So, do the study if you can, but I appreciate there may not be time for that. And it seems, if I may use these words, the ship has sailed in a way. I certainly get the sense, looking at the questions that have been put to us, that all the parties are kind of on board with a landmark building here. And 45 stories, it seems, because look, we can deal with parking, maybe we can get more affordable housing, we can create this visual beacon. So if in fact the community and the developer and the city are on board with this, well, what do you do? My recommendation, by the way, is to find other strategies to deal with parking and family size housing and go with the mid-rise option and stick with the plan you have, because frankly, it's an excellent plan that you have. And I'm not saying that because I wrote the secondary plan. Cal wrote the urban design plan that actually put all the details to that and really made the case for a special place. Yes, it could accommodate tall buildings, but let's study that holistically. So just to go to those questions that have been put to us, if in fact that ship has sailed, and you are moving towards going with a tall building, to my earlier point, I would not put a 45-story cap on. That height limit already goes beyond the height of the escarpment. I would say there is no height limit, that you actually go through a design competition, and that's the route you need to go through if you truly want to ensure this building is exceptional. The question is, what kind of tools can you do? Policies, guidelines. Policies are going to be almost useless in ensuring you get this exceptional building, right? That's a very subjective term. So if you want to put limits on floor plate, on height, on separation distance, maybe that's okay, but you can't do a lot more than that. You can't really get into what the architecture of this building is. So it's fundamental. If you want a landmark tower, you must set up a design process that is going to give you the best chances of getting that exceptional building. So that's an international design competition. Bruce Korobara certainly is one of Canada's finest architects. I have full respect for him, but if he's retained as the architect for this, he will not have the freedom that he should have to design this building. So it needs an international design competition. You need a very detailed terms of reference with all kinds of sort of guidelines in it, put some parameters around things, clarify the objectives. And of course, you need a very strong jury from both local and international design experts to guide you through that process and help you make the ultimate decision. So I wanted to try and provide some useful feedback if in fact you're already gone down, you've already effectively made the decision to do a landmark building. But you know, I'm on the same page with my colleagues here that really this is a very risky move and could set a very dangerous precedent. And so if you're going to do it right. Go back and properly review and update the urban design study. And I will end there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tim. If you wouldn't mind taking the chair, Tim. I share the comments of everyone on the panel. Definitely, it's a precedent. I mean, there's definitely an opportunity once the first tower's up to stretch that argument further. And I don't share the notion of changing the entire quality of the development that you so creatively developed back in 2016. That I think the landmark is not a building so much as is what you created in terms of the policy and the planning that you had put in place in 2016. That is the real addition to the city. That's where the real value is. I don't see an environment where you've got a high-rise building sitting next door to 8-story buildings being anything different than what you're going to see elsewhere. And I just don't share that view. And without a further study that takes into account, listen, you're gonna put up a high-rise building. The units are going to be quite expensive. People are going to expect parking at the doorstep. They're not going to walk 300 meters to a garage. That's not going to happen. So the reality of the situation is that I think you should take a broader view of what the ramifications on the rest of the site are and see if this even makes any sense. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you. So thanks to everyone, and I think it was a great presentation. There's lots of food for thought here.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.